Welcome to Unit 5, Lesson 6, The American Revolution, Hardship and Challenges. Even the most satisfying success can be short-lived, especially in wartime. You're up one day and down the next. Challenging as it may be, you just have to hang in there. The main idea for today's video is the Continental Army faced hardship and challenges at Valley Forge and on the frontier. Valley Forge. As you learned about in the last lesson, the victory at Saratoga boosted American morale, but there was much more work to be done. The focus of the war shifted to Pennsylvania, where General Howe now occupied Philadelphia. You probably remember that the Continental Army set up camp at Valley Forge, northwest of the city, in the dead of winter of 1777. George Washington set up camp alongside his men, high atop a series of hills. Washington vowed to share in the hardship and partake, which means to take part in, of every inconvenience his soldiers experienced. While Washington certainly suffered, he lived with his aides in a stone house at Valley Forge. His men lived in small wooden huts they built themselves and used straw they gathered for bedding. They were freezing to death. Meanwhile, General Henry Clinton had become the new commander of British forces in North America. In contrast to the Americans, Clinton and his men settled into quarters in Philadelphia, where they lived in relative comfort. Loyalist families gave them places to stay, and Clinton and his officers enjoyed parties and good food. The soldiers in the Continental Army suffered greatly from the cold and a lack of food, and some chose to desert or run away from the army. But despite the horrible conditions, most soldiers chose to stay. Loyal to General Washington and determined to keep up the fight, they spent the winter training under von Steuben. As winter wore on, others arrived to help the American cause. Lafayette came to command a division at Valley Forge. In addition to sharing his men's hardships, the Frenchmen provided uniforms and muskets to those who needed them. Spring's arrival brought not only better weather, but also great news. Word of the alliance between America and France reached the camp. To celebrate, Washington had his men line up and shoot their guns in the air. They were poised and ready to do the battle at Monmouth.
1777. With winter setting in and the British at Philadelphia, George Washington chose to make the winter camp at Valley Forge. So what was life like at Valley Forge? The Continental Army was on the brink of collapse. There wasn't much to eat. The troops dined on a meal of rice and vinegar, or fire cakes, a gross mixture of flour and water. As well as short food supplies, there was a lack of clothing, blankets, or shoes. The lack of shoes made the soldiers leave bloody footprints in the snow. Disease spread quickly throughout the camp because of the crowded tents and cabins. Typhoid fever, pneumonia, and smallpox took the lives of many soldiers. Washington was desperate to keep his troops from deserting. He made lashings and shooting by firing squad as punishment. The winter at Valley Forge might have signaled the end of the American Revolution, but George Washington didn't give up. Prussian General Friedrich von Steuben joined the camp and trained the Continental Army. The French joined the American fight for freedom, sending military supplies and troops. George Washington could now focus on his strategies to defeat the British. In March 1778, Washington led his troops with their confidence restored out of Valley Forge to face the British again.
War on the frontier. Pennsylvania wasn't the only place where war raged. From New York to Georgia, skirmishes or small short battles took place along the rural western boundary of the frontier. Small divisions of the British Army guarded forts in this region, supported by Native American volunteers. Remember that at the outset of the American Revolution, many Native Americans supported the British. They feared that if the Americans won, they would take over more Native American land. British General Henry Hamilton and his Native American allies planned to invade the frontier, but American frontiersman George Rogers Clark heard of these plans and led a small force in a surprise attack on one of the British bases, Fort Vincennes. Hamilton surrendered, and the joint British-Native American offense was halted. Despite Clark's victory at Vincennes, American settlers found themselves constantly battling Iroquois forces. The fighting caused homelessness and food shortages in many communities. Just a quick review before we end this video. The Continental Army set up camp at Valley Forge during a harsh winter, under the command of General George Washington. They barely had any food, they were starving to death, freezing to death, so many decided to desert, which means run away from the army. Spring finally came, and it started to get warmer, and the Americans made an alliance with France. From New York to Georgia, there were many skirmishes, which were small, short battles, and many Native Americans supported the British. This made a lot of sense, because they were afraid that the Americans would take over their land, which eventually they do. That's all for today's video.